So I recently finished Domenico Losurdo's book, Western Marxism: How It Was Born, How It Died, How It Can Be Reborn. Having read two and a half of Losurdo's books by now, I'd mainly recommend his work to people who are at least passingly familiar with the major figures of 18th to 20th century philosophy. Some of his discussions go a bit over my head, though the book is overall fairly accessible. If you've already watched every single Gabriel Rockhill lecture and interview under the sun, like I pretty much have, a lot of the stuff Losurdo talks about isn't new, which is basically that many Western Marxists, especially in academia, are sellouts to capitalism that aren't actually interested in changing the world for the better, which is true. But Losurdo takes it a step further. Losurdo contrasts this Western Marxism, which is idealist, interpretive rather than interventionist, etc., with Eastern Marxism, which is materialist, liberatory, and so on. There's absolutely some truth to Losurdo's overall arguments, and I think Losurdo absolutely is more accurate in his interpretation of the world than most, but I think there's a more truthful and materialist interpretation that can be made, which I'll get to after I explain why I think Losurdo's thesis is flawed in the first place. Though his thoughts on many Western Marxists are interesting, especially his evisceration of Negri and Hart and their books like Empire, which serve as archetypal examples of the compatible left, Losurdo makes some stretches to make the dichotomy he's trying to set up work, such as his criticisms of Jean-Paul Sartre and Louis Althusser, which feel more like nitpicking to bolster his thesis more than anything. Western Marxists, so-called, like Sartre and Althusser, had great sympathies for Eastern Marxism after all, even if they made poor choices at times. If you wanted to talk about who had sympathies for capitalism, you could make plenty of much stronger critiques of Mao, the archetypal Eastern Marxist, and his late-in-life support of the US against the Soviet Union, for example. And contrary to what people seem to be aware of, the Soviet Union made many concessions to China under Khrushchev, but Mao fostered and promoted the split anyways, so it's not like Mao is just some innocent figure. The dichotomy Losurdo creates of Western versus Eastern Marxism kind of veers dangerously close into campism or even outright chauvinism, as it risks valorizing Eastern Marxists as almost inherently better. Yes, most revolutions happened in the geographical East, but Eastern Marxist movements also experienced major failures in places like Cambodia, not to mention the many disturbing distortions of Marxism under Juche thought. To be clear, I support North Korea's historically righteous claim to the Korean peninsula over that of South Korea, but North Korea and the Juche ideology is an example of some portions of the Western left's dogmatism in defending Eastern Marxism. Juche is not just some unique and necessary adaptation to the material conditions of North Korea. For one, Juche says it is a new evolution of Marxism-Leninism rather than an adaptation. Juche in reality is a nationalist distortion of Marxism similar in some ways to Baathism, and which was created by an opportunist slimeball weasel who literally is now a South Korean defector. The creator of Juche literally fled North Korea, so if the guy primarily responsible for a state ideology becomes a traitor to that same ideology, he probably was never on your side when he made that ideology in the first place. Another example of Eastern Marxism not working out is, of course, the Shining Path, which massacred tens of thousands of people and also was inspired by Eastern Marxism and Mao. Geographically, Losurdo's thesis is also troubled by the presence of Cuba, probably the best example of a current socialist state, but which is in the Western Hemisphere, not to mention the Zapatistas and to a lesser extent the Sandinistas, Bolivia, and Venezuela. I believe at some point that Losurdo acknowledges the geographical awkwardness of the label, but it doesn't take away from the fact that no matter what, the term remains geographically awkward. While I think Losurdo's thesis is onto something, the better distinction, I think, is a dichotomy between what I've kind of developed as my outlook, which is between the national left and the international left. National leftism is fundamentally concerned with inward problems, and it can manifest in both the West and the East. It either does not include Marxism in its analysis or does so in distorted ways. For example, the American left is famously perceived as nationalist rather than internationalist, frequently engaging in justifications or outright defenses of American foreign policy. See the many Trotskyists like Hitchens and Burnham who went on to become neocons. They deeply struggle to perceive the world beyond the boundaries of the state in which they live. One common manifestation of the national left are those people that believe unions should only exist to advocate for the interests of the workers in that union, and everyone else can get screwed over. They believe that unions don't need to stand for international solidarity with the interests of all workers, it's all just about that one union. These national leftists struggle to understand people not as Americans or Iranians or as Russians, but as humans. Personal national interests so supersede international solidarity for the national leftists that even a literal genocide supported by one presidential candidate will be excused by the national left if the other candidate means worse for the people of that national left. The international left, on the other hand, is a left that focuses on the world socialist movement, on liberating the world from capitalism by any means possible. Karl Marx was one of those people who was relentlessly internationalist in his perspective. Workers of the world unite, as he famously wrote in the Communist Manifesto, not workers of England or Germany, workers of the world unite. China, for its many admirable successes that I have pointed out and praised, is in some ways an example of the dangers of national leftism. The left movement in China is obviously far stronger than in America, but it is still national in its perspective in many ways, and that it clearly believes China's interests should still come first before the rest of the world. China's do-nothing mentality to let the US fail on its own has certainly worked to show the ineptitude of the US, but it has also shown how many people can die and have their lives destroyed without an opposing power willing to stand up to the US's invasions like the Soviet Union once did. If China had stood up for Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, not just with words but with actions, things might not be as bad for those countries as they are now. They at least certainly couldn't have ended up much worse than they did. Iraq trades with China now for oil, so you can say the masses of China may have benefited in the long term, but did the masses of Iraq? Some apparent Chinese leftists are clearly obsessed with not only non-intervention, but not criticizing China, and will reflexively defend any criticism of China by saying, focus on your own country's policies, or something along those lines. Some of these people, it's pretty clear, they're not socialists, they are nationalists, and at best, national leftists, who will take the line of their country no matter the choices it makes, rather than stand up for the international working class. Instead of semi-arbitrary geographical boundaries, the dichotomy of national versus international leftism relates to a core conflict which exists in basically all countries and which has been a debate pretty much since the beginning, which is whether to only focus on socialism for your own country or to focus on socialism for all countries. Once the Soviet Union's productive forces were established and the living standards of its own people had been greatly increased, the Soviet Union was able and willing to invest massive amounts of money in supporting national liberation movements around the world that weren't necessarily expected to provide much direct profit back to the Soviet Union, rather than serving as a trade partner and ally. It was this international leftist spirit that fought against capitalism and which for the most part actually protected the workers of the world, as Karl Marx called for. China's productive forces are now at a far greater extent than the Soviet Union ever was, and yet they are still simply not doing nearly enough to defend places like Gaza from one of the most horrific violations of human rights in human history. Imagine if the Soviet Union had let Vietnam, Cuba, Korea, and other countries simply be overrun by capitalism during the Cold War. Imagine the world we'd have today. Judging by the UN's own laws, if a state is manifestly failing to protect its citizens from mass atrocities and peaceful measures are not working, the international community has the responsibility to intervene at first diplomatically, then more coercively, and as a last resort with military force. China has a totally just and unquestionable casus belli under international law to intervene and stop the genocide in Gaza with military force. China and its leaders would become heroes for all of history for this, and damage even further the legitimacy of the US as the so-called protector of the world. Anyways, I'm not saying the national versus international liberal doesn't also have some problems. National leftists, for one, will appeal to internationalism dishonestly to avoid and dismiss national liberation movements. For example, people will say Hamas is worthless because it's not a socialist movement that doesn't actually believe in socialism. And this is true, but what it ignores is that a stable national movement must be formed to create international solidarity in the first place. The way you create international solidarity is by first improving the living standards in your own borders enough so that people are able to care about people beyond their own borders. And also, this is why we see socialist movements like PFLP allied with Hamas. And when you actually look at the politics of these kinds of anti-national liberation people, they frequently defend their own country's actions and rarely seem to be all that critical. So again, it's just dishonestly weaponizing internationalism to fulfill national interests. Anyways, I hope this video is helpful. After I wrote this script, Critical Theory Workshop, which is run by the editor of the book I'm reviewing, Gabriel Rockhill, released a great discussion on the book where one of the guests, John Bellamy Foster, basically said many of my criticisms of Losurdo's book and more, so I recommend checking that out as well if you're interested in more about this topic. And remember that if you want to support me, you can do so by subscribing to my Patreon. It would always be a big help to throw a few extra bucks my way. And that's about all. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.
Расцветали яблони и груши, поплыли туманы над рекой.